Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the newly published report from the National Audit Office, which has reviewed the level of fraud which Rishi Sunak not only allowed as Chancellor during the height of the COVID times, but is now refusing to chase down. You seriously will not believe how much it is. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, the National Audit Office has carried out, an audit of the fraud specifically which took place during the height of the pandemic. Now, being fair, it points out that the risk of fraud inevitably increased at this time as the government had to set up programs quickly. And that's fact. Just to be clear, I'm not going to bash Sunak for some loopholes which inevitably will have occurred as he rushed to try and keep businesses and workers afloat. It's an emergency situation. We get that. That's fine. Other countries had the same issue. But what I will say is there are two very, very valid criticisms of Rishi Sunak, Chancellor at the time, when it comes to the scale of this corruption. First of all, there's no hindsight about some of the fraud which took place. I remember MPs at the time telling Sunak that some of the way he was arranging both furlough and PPE payments, for example, was unnecessarily risky. For example, when other countries were using schemes to make sure that businesses and workers could get by, during lockdowns, to make sure they could keep their heads above water, they made sure that the businesses benefiting didn't have dodgy offshore tax arrangements. We didn't. So billions of pounds potentially just disappeared straight out the country into those tax havens. Obviously, we also now know as well that a lot of the money spent on PPE was completely wasted because it was given to friends and donors who had no more idea than you or I about how to provide large quantities of medical equipment. But the second and biggest criticism for me is that Sunak basically wrote the fraud off, or the vast majority of it. I mean, okay, he set up furlough and PPE procurement, and he had to do it quickly. Some people use the confusion and the haste to defraud the system. Criminals exist. They're always going to be there. They're always going to try and take some money that's not theirs. Okay. But once the dust settled, the Treasury should have gone through the books and recovered any money which should not have been paid out. I will remind people that the government actively pursues the overpayment of benefits to people who do not even fraudulently claim it. If they're poor people, they will chase it down. Basically, the government go to any lengths to recover relatively small sums of money paid to poor people. So, of course, they can easily chase after much larger sums, hundreds of millions of pounds in some cases. So why don't they? That would be even more efficient. But just as easy to chase down £10 million as it is £2,000. Why don't they do that? Because some of that fraud may be deliberate on the part of some involved in the process. But even where it isn't, the trail can easily lead to people closely connected with the government. Could be friends of ministers, business associates of ministers, donors, maybe even the wife of the Prime Minister. And if all this seems harsh, ask yourself this: why will the government employ people to scrutinise benefit payments and chase down anything which might have been an overpayment, even an innocent one? But they do not do the same for much larger sums of taxpayer money, which involves rich people. Let's be honest, there is no good reason, is there? But just how much money are we talking about here? Because we've seen odd little things. We've talked about a few billion here on furlough fraud, another few billion here on PPE fraud and so on. The audit estimates that in the tax year 2020 to 2021, which is of course the main height of the pandemic, between £33.2 billion but up to £58.8 billion was defrauded from the public purse. Now, if we take the midpoint, we can say that our estimate is £46 billion. This is money that the government are not really trying to recover, or at least most of it. There's the odd exception, the odd showcase. Yes, they're trying to chase down benefit fraud. Yes, they're trying to chase down Michelle Mone, although that seems to be taking its time. The police raided Michelle Mone's house. When was it now? Was it last year, or was it even the year before now? It's so long I can't actually remember. Nicola Sturgeon's husband attracts the attention of the police. They've nicked his caravan. Why haven't they impounded Michelle Mone's yacht? But anyway, those aside, a lot of it, Sunak's just gone, no, it's happened, it's terrible, isn't it? These naughty people. Am I going to chase them down? No, I'm not going to do that. Now, let's put this money into some context, shall we, as well? Just, I keep saying these large sums of money, they're large sums, they're beyond our ken. Let's break it down. How should we start breaking this figure down? We take the midpoint, 46 billion. Remember, it could be as high as 59 billion. It's at least 32 billion. How do we break it down? 46 billion, midpoint. I know, let's look at how much this would be for everyone in the country aged 16 or over. If we say taxpayers in this country, by and large, are those aged 16 and over, okay? This fraud, which Sunak largely can't be bothered to try and recover, has cost all over 16s in the country between £600 and £1,100 on average, depending on exactly where it is. That's a lot of money being spent on, let's be honest, rich Tory scroungers. Because, a lot of this, remember, is furlough, PPE fraud and other similar schemes. So it's money that's basically gone to very rich people unlawfully. So let's look at another context. So how much did it cost you personally? See, if we use that midpoint of £46 billion, and remember, it could have been a bit less, but it could have been a bit more. But if we use that £46 billion, that works out at 7.5% of all the taxes raised by the government in that year. So that means 7.5% of all the taxes you paid in that year effectively went to rich criminals. So let's say you earn £30,000 a year. That would mean about £420 of your income tax and national insurance was spent on that fraud. That's not including, of course, other things you've paid VAT on. You've paid VAT on fuel and a lot of goods and some services as well. So for every £1,000 of goods and services you bought that have VAT on them, that's another 15 quid you were chucking onto the fraud pile. So those struggling on low wages were having to spend hundreds of pounds that they could have used for food on money for rich Tory fraudsters. So how does this fraud compare with, say, government expenditure? Because again, £46 billion, is it a lot? Is it a lot in terms of government expenditure? Well, in the same year, the government spent just over £42 billion on defence. That's all our military, everything. £42 billion. So this level of fraud, the midpoint, is greater than all of our military spending during that same year. In other words, because Sunak refused to chase down most of this fraud as both Chancellor and Prime Minister, he's saying it's more important for these fraudsters to keep their money than it is for us to have a modern military. Because after all, would the military say no to having some of that money for themselves? No, of course not. The fraudsters got more public money than our military. That's what this audit is saying. Fraudsters, criminals, got more money spent on them, public money spent on them than our military. Let's look at another interesting comparison. I like this one. The government spent just over £25 billion on the Home Office and Justice Department combined. That's policing in the courts. What we use to chase down criminals. This is so hilarious, it's tragic. Depending on how much this fraud came to exactly. So I'm using the midpoint of, £46 billion, but it could easily have been just over £50 billion. Remember, the audit says it could have been anywhere up to £59 billion. So it could easily be the case that we gave taxpayer money, our taxes, we gave more than double the amount of money to Tory criminals than we did to the police and courts. This is a government that literally spent twice as much on criminals as those who catch and sentence criminals. Can you imagine a more apt statistic to explain this Tory government? In fact, there are only two departments. I went down the breakdown of government expenditure, there are only two departments which had more public money than this secret department for rich Tory scroungers. There was the Department for Education and the Department for Health and Social Care. So this fraud was more money than every other individual government department. Apart from two government departments, no other government department got as much money as fraudsters that year. In fact, if you add that fraud amount to the £37 billion wasted on track and trace, because that should be considered fraud as well. And that also should be considered Rishi Sunak's responsibility. You know, you are talking about an amount of money, because remember, we needed a track and trace system, but the track and trace, it should have been done by the NHS. Instead, what they did is they called it NHS track and trace. It was nothing to do with the NHS. We should have used the NHS. We didn't. A parliamentary investigation found that £37 billion was completely wasted, that we got zero benefit. If we hadn't spent any money on a track and trace system at all, if we'd had no track and trace system at all, we wouldn't have been any worse off. That's how bad it was. It was of zero use. £37 billion budget. So add that on, and then you are talking an amount of money that's actually a little bit more than Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng cost us. So Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, personally blew as much money as Truss and Kwarteng. And this isn't counting the tens of billions that were wasted on Boris Johnson's brain farts. You know, like the plans for the bridge between Scotland and Ireland that then became a tunnel and then, oh no, let's not bother at all. Doesn't include the tens of billions that Brexit's costing us each year. No, this is purely money that Rishi Sunak as Chancellor spent on bog all and is refusing to claw back. It's actually more than the amount that Truss and Kwarteng cost us, and yet people say Sunak is the safe pair of hands. Got to be kidding me. And I remind you that this is all just what is objectively fraud. It doesn't include the 11 billion quid that Rishi Sunak again personally cost us when he didn't insure his bond buying scheme. That was just 11 billion quid just set fire to, just because he didn't do what he should have done, what he was advised to do. But that wasn't fraud, that was incompetence. But it was still Rishi Sunak that cost us that. You know, so the real figure, and if we were to include all the other Tories into your Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng and all the rest, if we were to include the entire figure for Tory fraud, that'd be way higher. Huge sums of money used to pay private contractors for what state-controlled departments would do cheaper. That's all money wasted. Even when they did give PPE contracts to their mates and donors, even when they delivered PPE that we could use, they still charged a hell of a lot for it. So we still got it for more money than we would have done if we'd have just done it through the Department for Health and Social Care. But that's not technically fraud in a legal sense because, you know, the government paid for something and got that something. But it's still public money that was spent on nothing of public value above a certain level. You know, I've just looked at the money wasted by our current Prime Minister in a single tax year. What would it look like if we added up all the money blown by the past 3 Prime Ministers over the past 3 years? Might end up adding up to an entire annual budget for the whole country. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.